Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the cobblestone nightmare of a medieval plague city, where the morning church bells aren't calling people to prayer. They're announcing how many neighbors died overnight. You can almost smell the smoke from the constant funeral pyres mixing with the stench of overflowing latrines, while somewhere in the distance, a town crier shouts the latest death toll in a voice that's grown hoarse from repetition. The rats scurrying past your feet aren't just annoying. They're carrying tiny passengers that will reshape the entire course of human history, and you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing our little global community come together for these midnight history sessions. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake on a straw mattress that's seen better decades, and immediately you know something's wrong. The air tastes metallic, heavy with smoke, and something else you can't quite identify, something organic and wrong. Through the single window of your cramped dwelling, you can see the first pale fingers of dawn creeping across a city that's been transformed into something from humanity's darkest nightmares. The church bells that normally mark the hours now toll constantly, their bronze voices announcing death after death after death. Your modern sensibilities are already screaming warnings that your medieval counterpart would never recognize. That persistent cough from the family next door? That's not just a cold. The way people hurry past each other without making eye contact? They're not being rude, they're trying to survive. The rats that boldly scamper across your floor in broad daylight? They're not just confident, they're carrying Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that will kill between 75 and 200 million people across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. But here's what makes your situation particularly hopeless. You don't know any of this yet. Germ theory won't be developed for another few centuries, so you have no idea that invisible microorganisms are waging war on your body. You think disease spreads through bad air or divine punishment, which means every decision you make will be based on fundamentally wrong assumptions about how to stay alive. The historical record shows that plague mortality rates in urban areas often exceeded 60%, with some cities losing up to 90% of their population. But historians still argue whether these numbers reflect actual deaths or simply the collapse of record-keeping systems as entire administrative classes were wiped out. What's not debatable is that you're waking up in a world where the odds of seeing next month are worse than a coin flip. As you sit up on your straw mattress, feeling the first pangs of hunger, you have no idea that your next decision, whether to seek water, food, or human contact, will likely determine how many days you have left to live. Your throat feels like you've been swallowing sand, and the logical next step seems obvious. Find water. But as you stumble toward the communal well that serves your neighborhood, you're walking directly into one of medieval urban life's most efficient killing machines. The well that everyone depends on sits maybe 50 yards from the nearest latrine pit, and medieval city planning wasn't exactly concerned with concepts like watershed protection or bacterial contamination. You join the small crowd of early risers gathered around the stone rim, each person lowering their leather bucket into the dark depths below. The water that comes up looks clear enough, certainly clearer than the murky stuff you sometimes see flowing in the gutters, but what you can't see are the microscopic armies of Vibrio cholerae, Salmonella typhi, and Shigella dysentery that are about to launch a coordinated assault on your digestive system. Here's a fun medieval fact that would horrify any modern health inspector. Most European cities of this era had absolutely no separation between their water supply and their waste disposal systems. London's Thames River served as both the primary source of drinking water and the main sewer, which is roughly equivalent to drinking from your toilet bowl. The concept of water treatment wouldn't emerge for centuries, so every gulp you take is essentially playing Russian roulette with a dozen different pathogens. But wait, it gets worse. That bucket you're using? It's been shared by dozens of people, including several who are already showing early symptoms of plague, dysentery, or typhoid fever. Medieval people did wash their hands, but usually in the same water source they were drawing from, creating a perfect closed loop of contamination. It's like a medieval version of double dipping, except instead of annoying your friends at a party, you're potentially signing your own death warrant. The water tastes fine. Better than fine, actually, since you're genuinely thirsty and your body is craving hydration. You drink deeply, feeling the cool liquid soothe your parched throat, completely unaware that you've just consumed what amounts to a biological weapon. Within hours, the cholera bacteria will begin colonizing your small intestine, producing toxins that will cause massive fluid loss. Medieval physicians called it the flux, and they had absolutely no idea how to treat it. Historians still argue whether waterborne diseases or airborne plague killed more people during medieval epidemics, but the smart money says it was probably a tag team effort. What's certain is that urban water supplies were so contaminated that many people preferred to drink weak beer or wine instead. Not because they were alcoholics, but because the fermentation process killed some of the harmful bacteria. As you wipe your mouth and prepare to face the rest of your day, you feel satisfied that you've taken care of one basic need. You have no way of knowing that the clock is now ticking, and that the cramping and nausea that will begin in a few hours are just the opening moves in a game where your medieval immune system is hopelessly outmatched. Your stomach growls with the kind of insistent hunger that makes clear thinking nearly impossible. So you head toward the market square where vendors hawk their wares under colorful cloth awnings. The scene looks almost cheerful from a distance. People bustling about, merchants calling out prices, the general hum of commerce that suggests life going on despite everything. But as you get closer, your modern sensibilities start picking up details that would send any health inspector into cardiac arrest. The meat hanging from hooks has that slightly greenish tinge that screams spoilage to anyone familiar with refrigeration. But in a world without ice or reliable preservation methods, slightly rotten meat is just Tuesday's special. The vendor cheerfully hacks off a chunk with a knife that's seen more blood than a medieval battlefield, wiping the blade on an apron that probably hasn't been washed since the last feast day. You're looking at what amounts to a bacterial buffet, where E. coli, salmonella, and Clostridium perfringens are having their own little medieval festival. But the real danger lurks in something that looks completely innocent: the grain. Those sacks of rye and wheat that form the foundation of medieval diet are often contaminated with ergot, a fungus that produces compounds chemically similar to LSD. Medieval people called it St. Anthony's fire, and it could cause everything from hallucinations and convulsions to gangrene and death. Imagine tripping on bad acid while your extremities literally rot off your body. That's ergotism, and it's hiding in what looks like perfectly normal bread ingredients. Here's where medieval food safety gets really creative. Preservation methods that would make your stomach turn. That fish that's been packed in salt for months? It's probably safe from bacteria, but it's also been sitting in its own decomposition juices long enough to develop flavors that would challenge even the most adventurous modern foodie. The cheese that's been aged in caves? Those aren't just flavor crystals. Some of those white spots are definitely mold, and not the good kind that makes blue cheese expensive. You settle on what seems like the safest option: a loaf of dark bread and some dried fruit. The bread feels solid enough, though it's got that slightly sour smell that suggests the grain was already fermenting before it was baked. Medieval bakers often mix sawdust, chalk, and other extenders into their flour to make it go further, so you're essentially eating construction materials seasoned with whatever bacteria happen to be thriving in the grain storage areas. The dried fruit looks harmless, but it's been sitting in open baskets where flies, rats, and human hands have all had their way with it. Medieval people understood that drying preserved food, but they had no concept of sterile handling or pest control. That sweet, chewy apricot you're enjoying has probably been sampled by a dozen different creatures, each leaving their own microscopic calling cards. Historians still argue whether malnutrition or infectious disease was the bigger killer during plague years, but the truth is they worked together like a perfectly coordinated tag team. Poor nutrition weakened immune systems, making people more susceptible to disease, while illness made it harder to keep food down, creating a downward spiral that was nearly impossible to escape. As you chew your questionable breakfast, you feel reasonably satisfied that you've made smart choices. You have no idea that you've just consumed enough pathogens to stock a modern laboratory, and that your digestive system is about to become a battlefield where medieval medicine has absolutely no effective weapons. With breakfast sitting uneasily in your stomach, you step out into the streets to begin your day, and immediately you're walking through what can only be described as an open-air biological warfare experiment. The cobblestones beneath your feet aren't just wet from morning dew. They're slick with a mixture of human waste, animal urine, rotting food scraps, and bodily fluids from the sick and dying who couldn't make it to proper facilities. Medieval urban planning had a charmingly simple approach to waste management. Throw it out the window and let gravity sort it out. The famous cry of Gardaloo that people shouted before emptying their chamber pots was supposed to give pedestrians time to dodge. But in a plague city where people are too sick or too panicked to follow social niceties, you're basically walking through a minefield of human excrement. Each step splashes microscopic droplets of contaminated material onto your clothes, your skin, and inevitably into your mouth and nose. But the real horror show is just getting started. As you navigate the narrow streets, you begin to notice the bodies. Not the neat, respectfully arranged corpses you might imagine from movies, but the harsh reality of urban death during epidemic. People who collapsed where they stood and were simply left there because there's no one healthy enough to move them. Some have been there for days, bloating in the sun and providing five-star accommodations for the rats and fleas that are the real stars of this medieval nightmare. Here's a delightful historical tidbit that really captures the spirit of the times. Medieval cities were so overrun with rats that some communities actually appointed official rat catchers as municipal employees. These brave souls would wade into cellars and sewers to battle rodent populations that sometimes outnumbered humans. Of course, they had no idea they were essentially wrestling with tiny biological weapons, since each rat could carry hundreds of infected fleas. The fleas are the real problem, though you can't see them with the naked eye as they leap from corpse to corpse, and eventually onto you. Xenocilla chiopes, the oriental rat flea, is perfectly designed for disease transmission. When it bites an infected rat, the plague bacteria multiply in its digestive system until they literally block its throat. The flea becomes so hungry it bites anything that moves, regurgitating bacteria-laden blood into each wound. It's like nature designed the perfect little plague delivery system and then mass-produced it. You try to stick to the center of the street, away from the worst of the filth, but that puts you in direct contact with other pedestrians who are making the same calculation. Every person you brush against, every breath you share in the narrow passages between buildings, every surface you touch has been contaminated by the sick, the dying, and the recently dead. Medieval people had no concept of personal space as a health measure. They crowded together for warmth, safety, and social connection, creating perfect conditions for disease transmission. The smell is what really gets to you, though. It's not just unpleasant. It's a complex bouquet of decay that includes rotting flesh, fermented waste, unwashed bodies, and the sweet, sick smell of infection. Medieval people believed that bad smells actually caused disease, so they carried herbs and flowers to ward off illness. Ironically, this miasma theory was completely wrong about the mechanism but accidentally right about avoiding some contaminated areas. Historians still argue whether urban crowding or poor sanitation was the bigger factor in plague transmission. But walking through these streets makes it clear that medieval cities were essentially giant petri dishes where every surface, every breath, and every step brought you into contact with death. The cramping in your stomach is getting worse, and that persistent cough you've developed overnight is starting to produce some concerning results. so you decide to seek medical attention. This turns out to be roughly equivalent to jumping from the frying pan into a blast furnace, because medieval medicine operates on principles that are not just wrong, they're spectacularly, dangerously wrong in ways that will actively accelerate your demise. You find the local physician in his shop, surrounded by jars of mysterious substances and charts showing the human body as medieval science understood it. He's actually one of the more educated people in the city, having studied at a university where he learned that disease is caused by an imbalance of the 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This theory is completely incorrect, but it forms the foundation of every treatment he's about to inflict on you. After examining your symptoms, the fever, the cough, the stomach pain, he nods knowingly and reaches for his most trusted tool, a sharp knife for bloodletting. Medieval physicians believed that most illnesses were caused by having too much blood, so the logical treatment was to drain some out. What they didn't realize is that blood loss weakens the immune system and reduces the body's ability to fight infection. You're about to receive a treatment that will make you significantly more likely to die from whatever's already attacking your system. But wait, there's more. The knife he's using has been employed on dozens of other patients without any sterilization beyond maybe wiping it on his already stained apron. Medieval physicians had no concept of antiseptic technique, so every medical procedure was also an opportunity for cross-contamination. That blade has been inside other people's bodies, collecting samples of whatever diseases they were carrying, and now it's going into yours. The bloodletting is just the opening act. For your stomach problems, he prescribes a mercury-based purgative that will cause violent diarrhea and vomiting, which, in his mind, will expel the evil humors causing your illness. What it actually does is cause mercury poisoning while dehydrating you to the point where your kidneys start shutting down. Medieval people noticed that mercury made patients produce dramatic symptoms, so they assumed it was working. It's like judging the effectiveness of a treatment by how much it makes you suffer. For your head pain, he suggests trepanation, drilling a hole in your skull to release the evil spirits or excess pressure that's obviously causing your discomfort. This procedure had a surprisingly high survival rate in medieval times, mainly because the human skull is remarkably resilient, but it also had a 100% rate of creating an open wound in your head that's perfectly positioned to develop infections that will spread directly to your brain. Here's a fascinating historical detail that really captures medieval medical thinking. Physicians often diagnosed illness by examining patients' urine, not just for color and clarity, but actually by tasting it. They believed that sweet urine indicated one type of imbalance, while bitter urine suggested another. So your doctor is literally drinking other people's bodily fluids as a diagnostic technique, then using the same mouth to examine other patients. The most expensive treatment he offers is theriac, a supposed universal antidote made from dozens of ingredients including viper's flesh, opium, and various exotic spices. It was incredibly popular among wealthy patients, partly because it was so expensive that it must be effective, right? The reality is that theriac was basically medieval snake oil, literally, in some cases, that provided no medical benefit while potentially introducing new toxins into already compromised systems. Historians still argue whether medieval physicians killed more patients than they saved, but the mathematical reality is pretty clear. Most medical interventions of the era were more dangerous than the diseases they were meant to treat. As you leave the physician's shop with fresh wounds from bloodletting and a stomach full of mercury, you feel confident that you've taken decisive action to address your health problems. You have no way of knowing that you've just paid someone to make you significantly more likely to die. As you stumble home from your medical appointment, feeling considerably worse than when you left, you notice something unsettling about the way your neighbors are looking at you. Those sideways glances aren't just casual curiosity. They're the calculating stares of people who are trying to decide whether you represent a threat to their survival. In a plague city, paranoia isn't a mental illness. It's a survival strategy, and you're about to discover that your fellow citizens can be more dangerous than any disease. Medieval communities developed an informal but ruthlessly efficient system for identifying potentially infected individuals. That cough you've been trying to suppress? Everyone heard it. The way you've been walking a little unsteadily since your bloodletting? They noticed. The fact that you visited the physician? Word travels fast in a neighborhood where everyone knows everyone else's business. And seeking medical attention is often seen as confirmation that you're already infected. The woman who lives 2 doors down, the one who always seemed friendly before, now crosses herself when she sees you and hurries her children inside. The baker who sold you bread this morning refuses to make eye contact. These aren't cruel people. They're terrified people who have watched their community shrink by half in the past month. And they've learned that survival often depends on avoiding anyone who might be carrying death in their lungs. But here's where medieval social dynamics get really ugly. Communities under extreme stress need someone to blame, and sick people make convenient scapegoats. If you show symptoms, you're not just ill, you're potentially responsible for bringing God's wrath down on the entire neighborhood. Medieval people believed that disease was divine punishment for sin. So a sick person wasn't just a medical problem. They were a moral problem that needed to be solved. The local authorities have developed their own brutal but effective quarantine system. If enough neighbors report that you're showing symptoms, officials will simply board up your house with you inside. They'll nail wooden planks across your door and windows, paint a red cross on the front, and post a guard to make sure you don't escape. The theory is that you'll either recover in isolation or die without infecting anyone else. The reality is that you'll probably starve to death even if the disease doesn't kill you. Here's a charming historical detail that really captures the spirit of medieval community cooperation. Many cities offered bounties for reporting suspected plague cases. Neighbors could earn actual money by turning in people who showed symptoms, creating a system where your closest friends had financial incentives to betray you. It's like a medieval version of a police state, except the police are your next-door neighbors and the crime is being sick. The paranoia goes both ways, though. You're starting to look at your neighbors with the same suspicious eyes, wondering who might report you to the authorities. That friendly conversation you had with the blacksmith yesterday? Maybe he was just gathering information to use against you. The way the children stopped playing when you walked by? Perhaps their parents have already warned them to stay away from the dangerous sick person. Medieval record-keeping shows that community-reported quarantines had a nearly 100% fatality rate. Not because the disease was always fatal, but because being locked in your house without food, water, or medical care was essentially a death sentence. But historians still argue whether these harsh measures actually slowed disease transmission or just created additional ways for people to die. The social isolation is almost as dangerous as the physical symptoms. Humans are social creatures, and the stress of being treated as a walking plague vector weakens your immune system just when you need it most. You're not just fighting disease. You're fighting the psychological warfare of knowing that everyone around you sees you as a threat to be eliminated rather than a person to be helped. As you reach your door, you notice fresh scratches in the wood. Someone has been testing whether it's sturdy enough to nail shut. Your neighbors aren't just watching you anymore. They're preparing for the day when they'll need to seal you inside your own home. The coins in your purse are dwindling faster than your health, and you're faced with a choice that perfectly encapsulates the impossible mathematics of survival in a plague city. Stay inside where you're relatively safe from infection but guaranteed to starve, or venture out to work where you might earn enough to eat but will almost certainly expose yourself to more disease. It's like choosing between death by starvation and death by plague, except one is slow and certain while the other is fast and probable. Your usual work. Let's say you're a craftsman who makes leather goods. Requires you to interact with customers, handle materials that have passed through multiple hands, and spend time in workshops where other people are breathing, coughing, and sweating in close quarters. Every transaction is a potential death sentence, but every day you don't work brings you closer to the kind of malnutrition that makes disease even more deadly. The economic reality of plague cities creates a vicious cycle that's almost impossible to escape. As more people die, there are fewer workers available, which should theoretically drive up wages. But there are also fewer customers with money to spend, and the constant threat of death makes long-term business planning impossible. You might negotiate a good price for your work today, only to discover tomorrow that your customer has died and their family has no intention of honoring the agreement. Medieval labor markets during plague years operated on principles that would make modern economists weep. Supply and demand curves become meaningless when both suppliers and demanders are dying at exponential rates. The blacksmith who was charging premium prices last week might be dead today, leaving his tools to rust while people desperately need horseshoes and nails. Meanwhile, the surplus of leather goods from deceased craftsmen means your products are competing with inventory from people who no longer need to eat. Here's a fascinating economic detail that really captures the surreal nature of plague commerce. Many cities experienced simultaneous inflation and deflation as different sectors of the economy collapsed at different rates. Food prices skyrocketed because farmers were dying and supply chains were disrupted. But luxury goods became nearly worthless because there weren't enough wealthy people left alive to buy them. You could trade a beautifully crafted leather purse for a moldy loaf of bread and consider yourself lucky. The workplace itself becomes a death trap in ways that medieval people couldn't fully understand. That workshop where you spend your days? It's poorly ventilated, crowded with people who can't afford to stay home when they're sick, and filled with materials that have been handled by dozens of potentially infected individuals. Every tool you pick up, every surface you touch, every breath you take in that enclosed space is a roll of the dice with death. But staying home isn't really an option either. Medieval cities didn't have social safety nets or unemployment benefits. If you don't work, you don't eat, and if you don't eat, you become even more susceptible to disease. Malnutrition suppresses immune function, making you an easier target for every pathogen floating around the city. It's a perfect catch-22. Working exposes you to disease, but not working weakens your ability to fight disease. The psychological pressure is almost as brutal as the physical danger. You watch coworkers disappear one by one. Some obviously dead, others simply gone without explanation. Maybe they fled the city, maybe they're locked in quarantine, maybe they're lying in an unmarked grave somewhere. The uncertainty is almost worse than knowing, because it forces you to confront the statistical reality that you're probably next. Historians still argue whether economic disruption or direct disease transmission was the bigger killer during medieval plagues. But the truth is they were inseparable. Economic necessity forced people into dangerous situations, while disease made economic activity nearly impossible, creating a downward spiral that destroyed entire communities. As you prepare to leave your house for another day of potentially fatal employment, you're making a calculation that no human should have to make. Is the money you might earn today worth the increased chance that you won't live to spend it tomorrow? The sound of chanting draws you toward the city center, where hundreds of people have gathered for a massive religious procession designed to beg God's mercy and end the plague that's devastating your community. From a distance, it looks like exactly what a desperate soul might need. Collective prayer, shared hope, and the comfort of knowing you're not facing this nightmare alone. What you're actually walking toward is the medieval equivalent of a biological weapon detonation, where every hymn sung and every prayer whispered becomes a vehicle for spreading death. The crowd is enormous, easily the largest gathering you've seen since the plague began. People have come from all over the city and surrounding countryside, drawn by promises that collective repentance might convince God to lift his terrible punishment. They're packed shoulder to shoulder in the town square, swaying together as they sing, their voices rising in desperate harmony toward heaven. It's genuinely moving, this display of shared faith in humanity's darkest hour, and also absolutely guaranteed to accelerate the epidemic in ways that will horrify future epidemiologists. Medieval religious gatherings operated on the principle that more people meant more spiritual power, so organizers actively encouraged maximum attendance. The bigger the crowd, the more likely God was to notice and respond to their pleas. What they didn't understand is that respiratory diseases spread exponentially in large gatherings, especially when people are singing, shouting, and breathing heavily in close quarters. Every voice raised in prayer is also launching thousands of microscopic droplets into the shared airspace. You find yourself swept into the crowd, pressed against strangers who are coughing, sweating, and showing various stages of illness. The woman next to you has the telltale fever flush of early plague symptoms, but she's here because she believes prayer might save her. The man behind you keeps wiping his nose on his sleeve, then using the same hand to steady himself against other people. It's like being trapped in a medieval petri dish where the growth medium is religious fervor. The procession begins to move through the streets, and you're carried along by the sheer momentum of hundreds of bodies moving as one. People are sharing water from common cups, passing religious relics from hand to hand, and embracing each other in displays of Christian brotherhood that would make any infectious disease specialist faint with horror. Every gesture of faith and community is also a perfect opportunity for pathogen transmission. Here's a delightful historical irony that really captures the spirit of medieval problem-solving. Many of these religious processions were organized specifically in response to plague outbreaks, meaning communities were using the exact activities that spread disease as their primary strategy for stopping disease. It's like trying to put out a fire by throwing gasoline on it, except the gasoline is human breath and the fire is bacterial infection. The religious authorities leading the procession are doing their best to maintain order, but they're also contributing to the problem in uniquely medieval ways. The priest at the front is sprinkling holy water on the crowd using a brush that's been dipped in the same basin hundreds of times. That holy water has been blessed by God, but it's also been contaminated by every person who's touched the brush, creating a sacred but deadly cocktail of faith and pathogens. The singing reaches a crescendo as the procession passes the cathedral, and you can feel the collective hope and desperation of hundreds of people who believe they're participating in something that might save their lives. The irony is heartbreaking. These aren't ignorant or foolish people. They're terrified human beings using the best knowledge available to them in a world where scientific understanding of disease is still centuries away. Historians still argue whether religious gatherings significantly accelerated plague transmission or whether the disease would have spread just as quickly through normal social contact. But the mathematical reality is pretty clear. Putting hundreds of potentially infected people in close quarters for hours at a time is epidemiologically equivalent to setting off a biological bomb. As the procession winds through the city streets, you're part of something that's simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. A community coming together in faith and hope, while unknowingly creating the perfect conditions for their own destruction. As the religious procession disperses, you notice a different kind of crowd gathering at the edge of the square. A group of men and women dressed in rough robes, carrying whips and wooden crosses, their faces twisted with a fervor that goes beyond ordinary religious devotion. These are the flagellants, and they represent medieval Christianity's most extreme response to plague. The belief that God's wrath can only be appeased through spectacular displays of self-inflicted suffering. What you're witnessing is religious theater that doubles as a public health catastrophe. The flagellants begin their ritual by stripping to the waist and forming a circle in the town square. Their leader, a wild-eyed man whose back is already crisscrossed with scars from previous sessions, begins chanting prayers while rhythmically striking himself with a leather whip embedded with metal studs. The others follow suit, and soon the air fills with the sound of leather hitting flesh and voices raised in ecstatic prayer. Blood begins to flow, spattering the ground and anyone standing too close. Medieval flagellant movements operated on the theological principle that human suffering could substitute for divine punishment, so if they hurt themselves enough, God might spare the community from plague. It's a kind of spiritual mathematics where pain equals salvation, and the more dramatic the suffering, the more likely it is to catch God's attention. What they're actually doing is creating open wounds in a disease-ridden environment while working themselves into states of religious ecstasy that compromise their immune systems. The crowd that gathers to watch is both horrified and fascinated. Some people genuinely believe they're witnessing holy men whose sacrifice might save the city. Others are drawn by the same morbid curiosity that makes people slow down to look at car accidents. But everyone who gets close enough to see the blood fly is also close enough to be contaminated by it, because medieval people had no understanding of blood-borne pathogens. Here's where flagellant theology gets really creative. They believe that Jews, foreigners, and other outsiders are responsible for bringing God's wrath down on Christian communities. As their religious frenzy intensifies, their chanting begins to include accusations and threats against anyone who doesn't fit their definition of righteous Christian. What started as self-punishment is rapidly evolving into a call for violence against scapegoats, because nothing says holy devotion like blaming minorities for natural disasters. The flagellants move through the city in a procession that's part religious ritual and part lynch mob. They stop at Jewish neighborhoods, foreign merchant quarters, and anywhere else they can find people to blame for the plague. Their bloody whips become weapons of persecution as they demand that God's enemies be punished for bringing disease to the faithful. It's medieval scapegoating at its most vicious, where religious fervor provides cover for ethnic cleansing. You watch in growing horror as the crowd's mood shifts from religious devotion to violent hatred. The same people who were praying for God's mercy minutes ago are now shouting for the blood of their neighbors. The flagellants have tapped into something primal and ugly, the human need to blame someone else for suffering that's too random and overwhelming to accept as natural. The violence that follows is swift and brutal. Houses are burned, people are dragged from their homes and beaten, and anyone who tries to intervene becomes a target themselves. The flagellants justify every atrocity as God's will, claiming that they're purifying the community by removing the sources of divine anger. It's genocide dressed up as religious devotion, and it's happening right in front of you. Medieval records show that flagellant movements often killed more people through violence and persecution than they saved through prayer, but historians still argue whether these groups were primarily religious movements that turned violent or violent movements that used religion as justification. What's not debatable is that they made plague cities even more dangerous for anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable. The most terrifying part isn't the violence itself. It's how quickly ordinary people join in. Your neighbors, people you've known for years, are suddenly participating in atrocities because the flagellants have given them someone to blame for their suffering. Fear and desperation have transformed a community into a mob, and you realize that in a plague city, the living can be more dangerous than the dead. As you back away from the scene, trying to avoid being identified as either a participant or a target, you understand that you're not just fighting disease anymore. You're fighting the complete breakdown of social order, where religious devotion becomes an excuse for murder and collective trauma, transforms ordinary people into instruments of terror. The flagellants have created something worse than plague. They've created a reason for people to kill each other while convinced they're doing God's work. The blood on the cobblestones isn't just from self-inflicted wounds anymore. It's from innocent people who became scapegoats for a disaster that has no human cause and no human solution. And as you hurry away from the violence, you can't shake the feeling that this is only the beginning, that a community willing to turn on its own members has already died, even if some of the bodies are still walking around. As darkness falls over the city, you retreat to your small dwelling with the naive hope that nighttime might offer some respite from the horrors of the day. But medieval plague cities don't sleep. They just shift into a different kind of nightmare, where the sounds of death become the soundtrack to your insomnia and every shadow might hide something that wants to kill you. You're about to discover that darkness doesn't bring peace. It brings a front-row seat to the systematic dismantling of human civilization. You lie on your straw mattress, trying to ignore the cramping in your stomach and the persistent cough that's been getting worse since your visit to the physician. The mercury he gave you is working its way through your system, causing muscle spasms and a metallic taste in your mouth that makes you want to vomit. But the physical discomfort is nothing compared to the psychological torture of the sounds filtering through your thin walls. The first death cart of the night rumbles past around midnight, its wooden wheels grinding against cobblestones as it makes its rounds through the city. The driver calls out, "Bring out your dead," in a voice that's grown hoarse from repetition, and you hear the sound of bodies being dragged from houses and tossed into the cart like sacks of grain. Medieval cities had to develop efficient corpse removal systems, because leaving bodies to rot in the streets created health hazards that made the plague even worse. Here's a charming detail about medieval death carts that really captures the spirit of the times. They operated on a fee-for-service basis, meaning families had to pay to have their dead relatives removed. If you couldn't afford the burial fee, your loved one's body would be thrown into a mass grave with dozens of other corpses, unmarked and unmourned. It was like a medieval version of budget funeral services, except the budget option was a plague pit filled with lime. The wailing that follows each pickup is heartbreaking. Families saying goodbye to people who were alive just hours ago, children crying for parents who will never come home, elderly people mourning spouses they've lived with for decades. But the sound that really gets to you is the silence that follows, when another house goes quiet and another family line ends forever. You're listening to the slow-motion collapse of an entire community, one death at a time. Between the death carts, you hear other sounds that make sleep impossible. People coughing themselves to death in nearby houses, their lungs filling with fluid as they drown in their own bodily fluids. Families arguing about whether to abandon sick relatives or stay and risk infection themselves. The occasional crash of breaking glass as someone either collapses or throws something in frustration at their helpless situation. But the worst sound is the rats. During the day, they were just an annoyance, scurrying through walls, stealing food, leaving droppings everywhere. At night, they become bold enough to venture into the open, and you can hear them moving through your house like they own the place, which, in a sense, they do. Medieval cities were designed by and for humans, but plague cities belong to the rats and the fleas they carry. You try to cover your ears, but that just makes you more aware of the sounds coming from inside your own body. Your heartbeat seems unnaturally loud, and you can't tell if it's racing from fear or from whatever disease is taking hold in your system. Your breathing sounds labored, and each exhale seems to carry the smell of something rotting from deep inside your lungs. You're becoming intimately familiar with the soundtrack of your own physical deterioration. The darkness outside your window isn't just an absence of light. It's a presence unto itself, filled with dangers that daylight at least makes visible. You know that people are dying out there, that bodies are being moved, that the social order is collapsing, but you can't see any of it. You can only listen and imagine, which is somehow worse than witnessing it directly. Medieval people believed that night was when evil spirits were most active, and lying here in the darkness, you're starting to understand why. It's not that supernatural forces are more powerful after sunset. It's that darkness makes every natural horror seem supernatural. The sound of rats becomes the scurrying of demons. The death carts become the carriages of the apocalypse, and your own labored breathing becomes the whisper of death calling your name. Historians still argue whether the psychological trauma of living through plague was as damaging as the physical disease itself. But lying here in the darkness, listening to your world die around you, the distinction seems meaningless. You're not just sick, you're terrified, isolated, and forced to confront the reality that you're probably going to die alone in a city that's already forgotten how to mourn its dead. As another death cart rumbles past and another family begins their wailing, you realize that dawn is still hours away, and this is only the beginning of what promises to be a very long night. You wake to the sound of hammering and realize with growing horror that the noise is coming from your own front door. Through the single window, you can see men with wooden planks and iron nails systematically sealing your house shut, while a crowd of your former neighbors watches from what they consider a safe distance. Someone reported your symptoms to the authorities, and now you're about to experience medieval quarantine in all its brutal, terrifying efficiency. The official quarantine policy sounds reasonable in theory. Isolate the sick until they either recover or die, preventing further spread of disease through the community. In practice, it's a death sentence carried out with bureaucratic precision. The men boarding up your house aren't being cruel. They're following established procedures designed to save the maximum number of lives by sacrificing the minimum number of people. Unfortunately, you're part of that minimum. But here's where medieval quarantine gets really horrifying. You're not alone in this sealed tomb. The authorities have decided that your entire household needs to be isolated together, which means the healthy, the sick, and the dying are all locked in the same small space with no way out. Your neighbor's teenage daughter, who was just showing early symptoms yesterday, is trapped here with you. So is the elderly man from next door who might not even be infected but happened to be visiting when the quarantine order arrived. The boarding up process is surprisingly thorough. They nail wooden planks across every door and window, leaving only a small slot through which food and water can theoretically be passed. A red cross is painted on the front of the house, along with the words, "Lord have mercy on us" in Latin, a warning to other citizens and a prayer for your souls. It's like being buried alive, except the grave is your own home and the burial might last for weeks. Medieval quarantine houses operated on a simple mathematical principle. Better to sacrifice a few people with certainty than risk losing many people through continued transmission. The authorities genuinely believed they were making the hard choices necessary to save the community, and from a purely statistical perspective, they were probably right. But statistics don't capture the psychological horror of being locked in a small space with people who are coughing up blood while you wait to see if you'll be next. The first few days are almost bearable. Food and water arrive regularly through the slot, delivered by people who maintain careful distance and speak to you like you're already dead. You and your quarantine companions try to maintain some semblance of normal social interaction, sharing meals and making conversation as if you're just temporary roommates rather than people waiting to die together. But medieval houses weren't designed for extended isolation. There's no proper sanitation system, no adequate ventilation, and no way to separate the healthy from the sick. The teenage girl develops full-blown plague symptoms within 48 hours, and suddenly you're sharing air with someone whose lungs are producing the kind of bloody foam that medieval physicians recognized as a sign of imminent death. Here's a delightful detail about quarantine house logistics that really captures the medieval approach to problem solving. There was no plan for removing bodies from sealed houses. When people died during quarantine, their corpses just stayed there with the living until the quarantine period ended. So you're not just trapped with sick people, you're trapped with decomposing bodies that create new health hazards while serving as a constant reminder of your probable fate. The psychological pressure becomes unbearable faster than you expected. The elderly man starts talking to himself, then to people who aren't there, then stops talking altogether and just sits in the corner rocking back and forth. The teenage girl alternates between fevered prayers and angry accusations against the neighbors who reported her family. You find yourself checking your own body obsessively for new symptoms, convinced that every minor ache or pain is the beginning of the end. The smell is what finally breaks you. It's not just the odor of unwashed bodies and poor sanitation. It's the sweet, cloying smell of infection and the unmistakable stench of death that seems to permeate every surface. Medieval people had no understanding of airborne pathogens, but they knew that bad air meant bad outcomes, and the air in your quarantine house is very, very bad. Food deliveries become less frequent as the days pass, partly because the delivery people are getting sick themselves, and partly because the authorities are starting to assume that everyone in quarantine houses is probably dead anyway. You're not just fighting disease anymore, you're fighting starvation, dehydration, and the complete breakdown of your sanity as you watch other people die while waiting for your own turn. Historians still argue whether quarantine houses actually slowed disease transmission or just created more efficient killing chambers, but the mathematical reality is pretty clear. Quarantine house mortality rates approached 100%, not because the disease was always fatal, but because the conditions inside made survival nearly impossible. As you sit in your sealed house, listening to the teenage girl's labored breathing and trying to ignore the smell of the elderly man who stopped moving yesterday, you realize that medieval quarantine isn't about saving lives. It's about managing death in a way that allows the community to feel like they're taking action against an enemy they can't see or understand. Through the small gap in your boarded-up window, you witness something that makes the plague itself seem almost merciful by comparison. The systematic transformation of your neighbors into a murderous mob driven by the need to blame someone, anyone, for the disaster that's consuming their world. What you're watching is the medieval mind's most toxic coping mechanism, where communities under extreme stress abandon reason and compassion in favor of violent scapegoating that makes the Black Death look like a natural disaster with a human face. It starts with whispers that filter through the thin walls of your quarantine house. Someone poisoned the wells. Someone brought God's wrath down on the faithful. Someone is responsible for this suffering, and that someone needs to be punished. The logic is seductive in its simplicity. If human beings caused this disaster, then human beings can stop it by eliminating the guilty parties. It's medieval problem-solving at its most dangerous, where complex epidemiological realities are reduced to simple questions of guilt and punishment. The Jewish quarter becomes the first target, because medieval Christian theology had already established Jews as convenient scapegoats for any community disaster. The same people who were your neighbors just months ago are now convinced that Jewish families deliberately poisoned water sources to destroy Christian communities. The evidence for this theory is non-existent, but evidence isn't the point. The point is having someone to blame who's different enough to kill without feeling like you're murdering your own people. You watch through your window as torch-carrying crowds surround Jewish homes, shouting accusations that would be laughably absurd if they weren't leading to real violence. They claim that Jews are immune to plague because they caused it, ignoring the obvious fact that Jewish communities are dying at the same rates as everyone else. Medieval anti-Semitism didn't require logical consistency. It just required a target that was familiar enough to hate but foreign enough to dehumanize. The violence that follows is swift and brutal. Houses are burned with families still inside. People are dragged from their homes and beaten to death in the streets. Children are murdered alongside their parents because medieval logic dictated that the sins of the parents were inherited by their offspring. It's genocide justified by epidemic, where the same communities that were praying for God's mercy yesterday are committing mass murder today in God's name. But Jews aren't the only targets. Foreign merchants who brought goods from distant lands are accused of carrying disease in their cargo. Traveling performers who entertained the community just last month are now suspected of spreading plague through their performances. Anyone who speaks a different language, practices different customs, or looks different from the local population becomes a potential scapegoat for suffering that has no human cause. Here's a historical detail that really captures the medieval approach to crisis management. Many communities held formal trials for accused plague spreaders, complete with testimony, evidence, and legal procedures. These weren't random acts of violence. They were carefully organized judicial murders where entire communities participated in the systematic elimination of anyone who could be blamed for their suffering. It was legalized genocide, complete with court records and official documentation. The psychological mechanics of scapegoating are almost as terrifying as the violence itself. You watch people you've known for years transform into something unrecognizable as they participate in atrocities that would have horrified them under normal circumstances. Fear and desperation have stripped away the social conditioning that normally prevents neighbors from murdering each other, revealing the capacity for evil that exists in ordinary human beings when they're pushed beyond their breaking point. The most chilling part is how quickly the violence spreads beyond the original targets. Once a community has decided that murder is an acceptable response to crisis, the definition of acceptable targets expands rapidly. The foreign merchants are followed by local people who traded with them. The Jews are followed by Christians who showed them kindness. Anyone who objects to the violence becomes suspect themselves, because opposition to scapegoating is reinterpreted as collaboration with the enemy. Medieval records show that scapegoating violence often killed more people than the original disasters that triggered it. But historians still argue whether communities that engaged in mass murder actually recovered faster from plague, or just created additional trauma that made recovery more difficult. What's certain is that the social bonds that held communities together were permanently damaged by the experience of watching neighbors murder each other. You're witnessing the complete breakdown of moral order, where the same people who were sharing food and praying together just weeks ago are now participating in systematic genocide. The plague may kill your body, but scapegoating kills your soul, and the soul of your entire community. It's the moment when human beings reveal their capacity to be more monstrous than any disease, more deadly than any natural disaster, and more terrifying than death itself. As the screams from the Jewish quarter reach your quarantine house and the smell of burning homes mingles with the stench of decomposition, you realize that you're not just trapped in a building. You're trapped in a community that has decided that murder is the answer to suffering, and that decision makes everyone less safe, less human, and less likely to survive what's coming next. By some miracle, or perhaps just mathematical inevitability, you've survived your quarantine house longer than your companions, and the authorities have finally unsealed your door. But the city you emerge into is unrecognizable, a hollow shell of its former self where entire neighborhoods stand empty and the few remaining survivors move through the streets like ghosts. The logical response seems obvious. Get out while you still can. What you're about to discover is that escape from a medieval plague city is like trying to escape from a sinking ship when all the lifeboats are already full of holes. The decision to flee seems rational, even inevitable. You've watched your community tear itself apart through violence and scapegoating. You've seen the complete breakdown of medical care and social services, and you've witnessed mortality rates that make staying in the city equivalent to volunteering for suicide. Along with perhaps 100 other survivors, you gather what few possessions you can carry and head toward the city gates, convinced that the countryside must offer better odds of survival than this urban charnel house. The first sign that your escape plan has serious flaws becomes apparent at the city gates themselves. The guards who normally collected taxes and regulated trade have been replaced by armed men whose job is to prevent anyone from leaving. Medieval authorities quickly learned that fleeing plague victims were excellent at spreading disease to previously unaffected areas, so they implemented the logical solution: trap everyone inside the infected city until the epidemic burned itself out. It's quarantine on a municipal scale, and you're about to become intimately familiar with the concept of collective punishment. The guards aren't being cruel. They're following orders designed to prevent regional catastrophe. From their perspective, allowing infected people to scatter across the countryside would spread plague to rural areas that might otherwise escape the worst effects. It's the same mathematical logic that justified individual quarantine houses, scaled up to entire cities. Better to sacrifice one urban population than risk contaminating the entire kingdom. But you and your fellow survivors are desperate enough to attempt what medieval people called the flight, the mass exodus of urban populations when cities became uninhabitable. Your group pools resources to bribe the guards, threatens violence, and eventually manages to slip through the gates during a shift change when the guards are distracted by their own survival concerns. You're free of the city, but you're about to discover that freedom and safety are two very different things. The countryside that you expected to offer sanctuary turns out to be just as dangerous as the city you left behind, but in different ways. Rural communities have heard about the plague devastation in urban areas, and they've developed their own strategies for dealing with refugees. Those strategies usually involve arrows, spears, and very clear messages about what happens to city people who try to bring death to farming villages. Here's a delightful medieval survival strategy that really captures the spirit of rural hospitality. Many villages posted armed guards on all roads leading into their communities, with instructions to kill anyone who approached from plague-infected areas. They weren't being unreasonable. They were protecting their families and livestock from a disease that could wipe out entire communities. But from your perspective as a refugee, the countryside has become a maze of small armed camps, each one ready to murder you for the crime of being a plague survivor. The few villages that don't immediately resort to violence have developed other methods for dealing with unwanted visitors. They'll sell you food and water at prices that would make medieval merchants blush, demand that you camp at least a mile away from their settlements, and require that you leave immediately if anyone in your group shows symptoms of illness. It's medieval social distancing taken to its logical extreme, where human contact becomes a luxury that most people can't afford. Your refugee group begins to fragment as the stress of constant rejection and the physical demands of travel take their toll. Some people turn back toward the city, convinced that familiar dangers are better than unknown ones. Others strike out on their own, believing that smaller groups are less threatening to rural communities. A few simply collapse from exhaustion and disease, adding their bodies to the growing number of corpses that mark the routes between plague cities and the countryside. The weather becomes another enemy. Medieval people fleeing plague cities rarely had time to prepare for extended outdoor living. So you're facing the elements with inadequate clothing, insufficient food, and no proper shelter. Rain turns roads into impassable mud. Cold nights claim the weakest members of your group, and the constant stress of exposure weakens immune systems that are already compromised by urban plague experience. But the most demoralizing discovery is that the plague has already reached many rural areas through trade routes, traveling merchants, and previous waves of refugees. The countryside that you expected to offer sanctuary is experiencing its own epidemic, complete with abandoned farms, empty villages, and the same mortality rates that drove you out of the city. You're not escaping the plague. You're following it around the landscape like a lost dog chasing its own tail. Medieval records show that rural mortality rates during plague years often exceeded urban rates, partly because rural communities had less experience dealing with epidemic disease, and partly because medical care in the countryside was even more primitive than in cities. The pastoral refuge you were hoping for turns out to be just another death trap, but with better scenery and fewer witnesses. As you and the remnants of your refugee group huddle around a small fire in the ruins of an abandoned farmhouse, listening to wolves howl in the distance and wondering if those sounds are actually wolves, you realize that there is no escape from a medieval plague. The disease has followed you out of the city. The countryside offers no sanctuary, and you're now homeless refugees in a landscape that wants you dead. Your desperate flight has accomplished nothing except to make you die tired, hungry, and alone instead of dying at home with familiar walls around you. You return to the city, or what's left of it, because dying in familiar ruins seems preferable to dying in unfamiliar ones, only to discover that the social structures that barely held civilization together have completely evaporated. The government officials who once collected taxes and enforced laws are either dead or fled. The guards who maintained order have abandoned their posts, and the complex web of authority that made medieval society function has dissolved into something that would make political scientists weep. Pure, undiluted anarchy where the only law is survival and the only authority is violence. The city gates stand open and unguarded, not because the authorities have become welcoming, but because there are no authorities left to guard them. The elaborate bureaucracy that once required permits, papers, and payments for everything from selling bread to building houses has simply vanished, leaving behind a power vacuum that's being filled by whoever has the strength and ruthlessness to claim territory. Medieval government was never particularly efficient, but it turns out that even inefficient government is better than no government at all. The first sign of complete social breakdown is the looting. Buildings that once housed government offices, tax collection centers, and official records have been ransacked by people desperate for anything valuable or useful. But this isn't the organized looting of a conquered city. It's the frantic scavenging of people who have realized that all the social contracts that normally govern human behavior have been suspended indefinitely. Property rights, legal ownership, and civil order have become meaningless concepts in a world where survival depends on taking what you need from whoever is too weak to stop you. The absence of law enforcement has created a situation that medieval political theorists would have recognized as the state of nature. Humanity without the civilizing influence of government, where life becomes exactly as brutal and short as philosophers always warned it would be. The city has fractured into a patchwork of tiny territories controlled by whoever managed to gather enough desperate people to form a gang. Some of these groups are led by former soldiers who at least understand military organization, but most are just collections of traumatized survivors who have decided that cooperation beats competition when it comes to staying alive. Here's a fascinating detail about medieval urban collapse that really captures the speed at which civilization can disintegrate. Most cities maintain detailed records of births, deaths, property ownership, and legal proceedings, but during plague years these records simply stop. Not because the scribes got lazy, but because the entire administrative class died or fled, leaving behind a documentary void that makes it impossible for historians to know exactly what happened during the worst periods of social breakdown. The economic system has reverted to something that wouldn't look out of place in the Stone Age. Money has become essentially worthless because there's nothing to buy and no one to trust in commercial transactions. Instead, people barter directly for goods and services, trading food for protection, shelter for labor, and weapons for anything that might extend survival by another day. It's medieval economics stripped down to its most basic elements, where value is determined by immediate utility rather than abstract concepts like currency or credit. But the most terrifying aspect of governmental collapse is the complete absence of dispute resolution. When people disagree about resources, territory, or behavior, there's no court system to appeal to, no law enforcement to intervene, and no social mechanism for resolving conflicts peacefully. Every disagreement becomes a potential death sentence, because the only way to settle disputes is through violence or the threat of violence. Medieval society was never particularly peaceful, but it turns out that even a corrupt and inefficient justice system is better than vigilante justice administered by whoever has the biggest sword. The various gangs that now control different neighborhoods have developed their own informal governments, complete with leaders, rules, and methods for enforcing compliance. Some of these micro-societies are relatively benevolent, focusing on mutual protection and resource sharing. Others are essentially criminal organizations that prey on anyone weak enough to be victimized. But all of them operate on the principle that might makes right, because there's no higher authority to appeal to when conflicts arise. You watch former merchants become warlords, former priests become gang leaders, and former neighbors become mortal enemies as the social roles that once defined medieval life dissolve into fluid categories based on who can command loyalty and who can deliver violence. The blacksmith who once made horseshoes now makes weapons for whoever can pay. The baker who once provided bread now hoards grain and sells it to the highest bidder. Everyone has become a refugee in their own city, and everyone is learning that civilization is a much more fragile thing than they ever imagined. The psychological impact of watching your entire society collapse is almost as destructive as the physical dangers. You're not just fighting disease and starvation, you're fighting the existential terror of realizing that all the institutions you trusted to maintain order were just shared illusions that evaporated the moment people stopped believing in them. The king's authority, the church's moral guidance, the merchant's economic stability, all of it was just collective agreement that could be withdrawn at any moment. Medieval political theorists believed that government derived its authority from God, but watching your city tear itself apart reveals a more uncomfortable truth. Government derives its authority from the consent of the governed, and when people become desperate enough, they withdraw that consent and create their own rules. The problem is that those new rules are usually written in blood and enforced through terror. As you navigate the ruins of your former civilization, avoiding the territory controlled by hostile gangs while searching for some pocket of stability where you might survive another day, you realize that the plague didn't just kill people, it killed the entire concept of society. You're living in a world where the only law is survival, the only authority is violence, and the only government is whatever you can create through force or persuasion. Medieval civilization has collapsed so completely that you're essentially starting over from scratch, except this time you're doing it while dodging plague, starvation, and the constant threat of murder by your fellow survivors. You've survived longer than most, longer than the physician who poisoned you with mercury, longer than the neighbors who reported you for quarantine, longer than the flagellants who blamed minorities for God's wrath, and longer than the authorities who tried to trap you in a dying city. But as you sit in the ruins of what was once a thriving medieval community, feeling the familiar symptoms that have claimed everyone else you've known, you're forced to confront the mathematical certainty that has been stalking you since the first church bell tolled death counts. In a world where half the population dies, your modern knowledge and immune system mean absolutely nothing against medieval reality. The irony is almost laughable, if you had the strength left to laugh. You know things that medieval people couldn't even imagine. That disease is caused by microorganisms, that contaminated water spreads cholera, that fleas carry plague, that mercury is poisonous, that bloodletting weakens the immune system. You understand germ theory, you know about antibiotics, you're aware of basic sanitation principles that won't be discovered for centuries. But all of that knowledge is useless when you're trapped in a world without the infrastructure to apply it. Your modern immune system, which seemed like it should be an advantage, has turned out to be a liability. Medieval people who survived childhood had been exposed to dozens of diseases that killed off the weak and left the strong with robust immune responses. Your immune system, pampered by vaccines and antibiotics, has no idea how to fight off the kinds of infections that medieval children routinely survived. You're like a hothouse flower trying to survive in a medieval wilderness, theoretically superior, but practically helpless. The plague that's finally caught up with you doesn't care about your superior education or your understanding of disease transmission. Yersinia pestis is the same bacterium that killed peasants and kings, scholars and illiterates, the devout and the heretical. It's a remarkably egalitarian disease that reduces all human pretensions to the same basic biological reality. You're a mammal, and mammals can die from bacterial infections, regardless of how much they know about bacterial infections. Here's the final cruel joke of medieval plague survival. Even if you had somehow managed to avoid infection for months or years, you would still eventually succumb to the secondary effects of societal collapse. The food systems that fed cities, the trade networks that supplied goods, the social structures that maintained order, all of it has been so thoroughly destroyed that long-term survival has become mathematically impossible. You're not just fighting disease, you're fighting the complete breakdown of everything that makes human civilization possible. The symptoms that are overtaking you now are grimly familiar from watching so many others die. The fever that makes thinking difficult, the swollen lymph nodes that throb with each heartbeat, the black spots on your skin that give the Black Death its name. Medieval physicians would recognize these signs immediately and begin preparing your soul for the afterlife, because they understood something that modern medicine sometimes forgets. Some diseases are just bigger than human beings, and sometimes the only thing you can do is die with dignity. You find yourself thinking about the statistical reality that historians still argue about. Did the Black Death kill 30% of Europe's population, or 60%, or somewhere in between? The numbers become meaningless when you're part of them, when you've transformed from someone who studies mortality rates to someone who contributes to them. You're about to become a data point in a historical catastrophe that will be analyzed and debated for centuries by people who never had to smell the smoke from mass funeral pyres or listen to the rumble of death carts in the night. The medieval worldview that you've been struggling against throughout this ordeal suddenly makes a certain kind of sense. If this is what life is like, if suffering is this random and overwhelming, if death is this arbitrary and inevitable, then believing in divine judgment and eternal reward becomes not just comforting but logically necessary. The alternative is accepting that existence is fundamentally meaningless, that all human effort is ultimately futile, and that the universe is indifferent to human suffering on a scale that makes individual lives completely insignificant. But there's also something oddly liberating about facing the mathematical certainty of death. All the social pressures, economic anxieties, and political concerns that dominate modern life suddenly seem trivial compared to the basic biological fact that you're a temporary arrangement of carbon and water that's about to return to its component elements. Medieval people understood this in a way that modern people have forgotten. Death isn't a failure of medicine or technology. It's the natural endpoint of biological processes that temporarily create the illusion of permanence. As your vision begins to blur and your breathing becomes labored, you realize that you're about to join the millions of people who have died from plague throughout human history. Your death won't be particularly significant or memorable. You'll be buried in a mass grave if you're lucky, or left to rot where you fall if you're not. But you'll be part of something larger than yourself. The great historical catastrophe that reshaped European civilization and reminded humanity that we're not as separate from nature as we like to pretend. The last thing you see before consciousness fades is the sun setting over the ruins of your city, painting the abandoned buildings in shades of gold and red that are almost beautiful. Medieval people would have seen this as a sign, perhaps God's promise that even in the darkest times, there is still beauty in the world. Modern people might see it as just the optical effects of light passing through atmospheric particles. But as you prepare to become part of the landscape you're observing, the distinction between medieval and modern worldviews becomes meaningless. You're dying, and the sun is setting, and that's about as much meaning as anyone can extract from the fundamental biological reality of existence. Your inevitable end isn't a tragedy, it's just mathematics. In a world where half the population dies, someone has to be part of that half. Today, that someone is you.